Hello out there in Radioland. This is Michael. This is the Street Preacher's Corner podcast. The podcast where we strive to be correct, strive to be entertaining, and sometimes we just strive. Well, folks, this is going to be a church history kind of episode. I'm trying to intersperse these with some other things. I was looking back, though, at the number of things we put out. I said before that the length, the duration, the lifespan of the average podcast is 8 episodes. People don't have as much to say as they think they have to say, our guests. We're looking at around 30. I was numbering them and stuff in the beginning, but then I started putting things up in a different order than anyway. So yeah, here we are. And so today we're going to be talking about a guy by the name of Dunstan, Dunstan, Dunstan. I call him Dunstan the Mad Monk. And usually when you talk about mad monks, you're talking about a guy named Grigory Rasputin from late 19th century Russia. Or I guess technically late 19th century Russia. I said that right, yeah. So anyway, but we're not talking about Grigory Rasputin, but if you really want a strange foe to look into, Rasputin's a man. Now we're talking about Dunstan the Crazy Monk, Dunstan the Mad Monk. I haven't decided what I'm going to call the guy. Now, before we get too deep into this little weird episode of church history, I think there are a few prefatory remarks that may be in order. I obviously have no way of knowing who is listening to this, and I have no idea what your level of familiarity with history in general is, or church history in particular. But no historical event happens in a vacuum. And one of the ideas, if you ever have tried to teach history or to get at that stuff, you know that everything leads to everything else. Nothing happens in a vacuum. So I think some explanation and some groundwork are necessary for those of you who aren't, marinated in this stuff like some of us. So church begins, Christ dies on the cross. That's important to figure out. But let's put it this way. This particular piece of church history takes place in 10th century Ireland, in Ireland/England, mostly Ireland. Back then, in case you don't know, British history is super complicated. They call it the United Kingdom because it used to be a bunch of little kingdoms ruled by different various people, and sometimes ruled by one guy, and then sometimes ruled by, it just shifted around and all that sort of thing. But so this is 10th century Ireland/England because at the time they were sort of the same place. Anyway, by the time you get to the 10th century, by the time you get to the 900s, the organization, the entity known as the Roman Catholic Church has been on the grow in power and clout for about 500 years. They date themselves back to the beginning of the New Testament. I date them to, the mid-5th century. Or mid-4th century, if you want to count the Council of Nicaea as being part of that. Anyway, so by the time you get to the 10th century, these guys have been around, and they've been moving and grooving, and they've been on the grow for about 500 years. Now, about 100 years before the story we're telling today, an interesting precedent had been set. Pope Leo III had crowned Charlemagne, who was the Emperor of France, the King of France. He crowned him as the Holy Roman Emperor. Now, when we have a president in America, we don't call him the Holy Moly President. So for Charlemagne to have a title like that, even the King of England is not the Holy King of England. For Charlemagne to get the title as the Holy Roman Empire, that's a big deal. So it puts the organization, the Catholic Church, who is, by the way, accountable to no one but itself, it puts it in a position at this point in history to make or break kings. Now, this organization decided who was in charge of Europe, for crying out loud, had a standing army at several points in its history, and would wage war on other nations. So this organization would decide who was in charge of a country, who was in charge of Europe. And as you see in later history, if a king who had been put on the throne by Rome didn't do what Rome wanted, then Rome would either, wage an army against him, or they would withdraw their approval, and they would absolve the Catholics in that kingdom from obeying that secular government. So when Thomas Jefferson talks about, in his letter to the Danbury Baptists, the separation of church and state, that's the idea, is that you do not want a marriage of church and state. And then people have taken that to mean whatever, but that's what's going on there. Anyway, so if a king had been put on the throne by Rome, didn't do what Rome wanted, Rome would just get rid of him. And so, they and Rome demanded tribute from the crowned heads of Europe because they had put them in power. They could remove them from power. That becomes a big problem later on in England, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Now, it is a common misconception in church history that everybody was Catholic until the Reformation. And truth is, it is way more complicated than that. Before the rise of the Catholics in the 5th century, there has existed, since the time of Christ, a group of people that maybe didn't even know each other existed, but this group, scattered all throughout the world, wherever the gospel has gone, is a group of people that believed the Bible and tried to obey it. There have been, and you can tell these people, you can differentiate them by the things they teach and the things they preach. There have been, since day one of the church, people who have preached key doctrines like salvation by faith, and they fought against popish nonsense once the Catholic Church became a big deal. You go through history, you'll find these guys, they have names, these little groups, these little clusters of people, like Henricans or Lollards or Vaudois or the Anabaptists. And despite persecution, despite whatever got thrown at them, they never completely died out because, among other things, Jesus said they wouldn't die out. Now, how many people there are of this group of the church there are at any point in history, that's not always easy to discern because, well, frankly, people who are running for their lives and hiding in caves don't leave much of a footprint when it comes to secular history. So it's not fair to say that everybody was Catholic until the Reformation, but it is fair to say that Rome had all the money and all the power, and a lot of the story I'm about to tell you is about money and it's about power. One more thing, there is a sentiment among scoffers and skeptics that religious people, whatever that means to them, are a bunch of superstitious, mush-brained simpletons with no critical thinking skills who will believe anything as long as you wrap some god or stuff around it somehow. I've talked to them and they say, "Oh, you believe in the magical sky genie?" That's because they think I'm an idiot. The folks that will believe anything if you stick God's name on it, they exist. I mean, there are people that if you take a magnifying glass and you burn a couple of spots on a tortilla chip where it kind of looks like what they think Jesus looks like, they'll get excited about it because it's a thing. Those people exist. But I would say among people who believe the Bible and treat the Bible as the final authority, there is a hard-nosed skepticism that is actually commended in Scripture. And the God of the Bible is a God of thought, a God of reason, a God that insists that you examine the evidence. As we go through the story of Saint Dunstan, the question you need to ask, and the question that should have been asked back then is, does God work this way according to Scriptures? Does God do the sort of things we're seeing happen according to Scripture? I mean, as Christians, we're not supposed to believe just any old thing that comes down the pike or comes up the pike or crawls up from beneath the pike. We're supposed to try all things and cleave to that which is good. When you don't do that, and especially if you don't do that because you have a blind loyalty to a religious system that asks you to believe ridiculous things, you become an idiot. A self-made idiot, if you will, but an idiot nonetheless. But Dunstan, Saint Dunstan, Father Dunstan, he's not an idiot, in my opinion. He's a con man. He flourished and he thrived in a religious system that rewarded clever people with power. There is, by the way, a very sanitized version of this man's life. And if you look him up, that's probably what you'll find. I'm going to quote from a couple of these sources. But the truth is narrated by him and compiled by various fanboys is much stranger. Now, Dunstan was born in 909 AD, so 10th century, in Glastonbury, Ireland. Now, little Dunstan's family, they're all very prominent and in the religious world and in the political world. His dad was a Welsh nobleman. His uncle was the Archbishop of Canterbury. And if you don't know who the Archbishop of Canterbury is, he is in charge of all the churches in England. That was his uncle. Dunstan's cousins were the royal family. And Glastonbury is kind of a strange place, even back then, or especially back then. It was Catholic dominated, like most of Ireland was back then. But Glastonbury, they took it up a notch. This is a village that claimed to be the burial place of King Arthur and the burial place of Joseph of Arimathea. You remember the guy who loaned Jesus his tomb? They claim that when he finally died, he was buried in Glastonbury, Ireland. In fact, according to the legends, not only was Joseph buried in this village, but he was buried with 2 pots containing the blood of Jesus Christ. Now, just think about that. Just think about that as a claim for a second. Just let that sink in. I mean, I don't want to chase this rabbit, but let's say you wanted 2 pots of the blood of Jesus Christ. How in the... I don't know how big the pots are. I don't know if we're talking about a gallon jug. I don't know if we're talking about a teaspoon. I don't know. How would you get it? And nobody I've read behind has any theories as to how this blood got collected. I mean, it's all over the walls and the floor where he was scourged. It's all over the cross where he bled out. It's all over the mercy seat up on the third heaven. But the idea that you could get little pots of it to keep and then be buried with it, and then to what avail? Just weird stuff. I mean, you could say maybe he took Jesus' body and milked him for the rest of the blood that was left, but that's just weird, creepy, ghoulish stuff. I am getting way off track. So also in Glastonbury is a church. It's the oldest church in Ireland. And depending on who you ask, it was commissioned as a church by Joseph of Arimathea after it descended from the heavens. I mean, the building came down from the sky. That's the story anyway. And the building, if the story is true, was still functional after 9 centuries of use. They don't build them like they used to. So it was a church in Glastonbury that if you attended it during certain feast days, it could earn you 30 years of indulgences. Now that is a Catholic teaching which you can pre-purchase forgiveness for sins. So that is 30 years of a license to sin. I assume that the church in which they were doling these things out, these little certificates or what, I don't know how they doled them. I don't know how if you knew you got them. But I'm assuming it was crowded on those days. I can't prove that. There was also an abbey, which if you don't know what an abbey is, it's sort of a college for monks, a training place for monks in Glastonbury that was very prominent. And there was a monastery associated with it. It's pretty prominent. So I bring all this up because everybody is a product of the age in which they live. That's me, that's you, that's everybody. And Mr. Dunstan was born well-connected and well-heeled at a time and a place full of biblical ignorance and legends and popish superstition. And his entire life reflects this. I'm telling you, folks, it is wild stuff. So just before his birth in 909-ish, his parents were attending a candle mass in which people attend the mass would all hold candles, hence the name. So you have the lamps on the wall, and you have the people holding the candles while the ceremony's going on. Supposedly in the middle of all this mass, all the candles went out in the entire congregation, as well as the lamps hanging on the wall. So while they're sitting there in darkness, a quote, fire descended from heaven and lit the candle in Dunstan's mother's hand, quote, thus miraculously foreshadowing how great a light from her should be born into the world. So Jesus says, I am the light of the world. And Dunstan's mom says, nope, my son is. Anyway, so how do we know this story happened? Well, dear friends, later on, decades later, when he was famous, Dunstan told people this story. Now, here's where you should be skeptical of a story like this. This is a guy telling a story about himself years after the fact, where he is the hero of the story, and we have no witnesses. But I suppose if you believe that the Mass transforms bread and wine into the flesh and blood of Jesus Christ, I guess you'll believe anything. Now let's make a quick detour here to make a comparison, because this is just one ridiculous story in a lifetime of ridiculous stories for old Dunstan. And scoffers will say that a story like this is it's on equal footing with the miraculous stories in the Bible. They'll say, well, you believe X, Y, Z in the Bible, so why wouldn't you believe this candle story? Well, let's pull on that thread for just a second, and then we'll let it go. You'll see these are really the same thing. These are really comparable, equivalent situations. So let's say you are a first century disciple of Jesus Christ. You walked with Jesus, you talked with Jesus, you were there for the miracles, you were one of the ones who fled when the soldiers came, you were there when he died, you were one of the ones who just sat around and confused and frozen into indecision. In fact, all the confusion, you sort of forgot that Jesus told you that he was going to die, that they were going to come and take him. You're not expecting a resurrection. You're just trying to figure out what happened to the guy you put your faith in. If he really was who he said he was, how in the world could soldiers have come and taken him? And how in the world could he have died such an ignominious death? See, so far, you're not the hero of the story. You're the chump. You're the wretch. You're the guy who doesn't deserve to be around Jesus because you didn't believe Jesus when he told you it was going to happen. And then you see him after he dies, after he resurrects, and he talks to you. And you spend the rest of your life testifying to that, and you seal that testimony with your own blood at the hands of Christ's enemies. No money, no fame, just the fellowship of his sufferings. You see how that's different than a guy who's rich and famous and powerful telling a hero story about himself that no one can prove or disprove? See how that's totally different? But back to Mr. Dunstan. So when he was a child, a little bit later after this candle story, his father took him back to the same church building, and Dunstan fell asleep during the services. So while he slept, he had a dream that there was a man in white garments with a, quote, heavenly countenance, and that man began to tell little kid Dunstan, that the building, the one he was asleep in, must be enlarged and elevated, and began to explain to this child how big it needed to be. So all the church kids who have ever fallen asleep in church and had weird dreams, please raise your hand. See, once again, Dunstan's telling the story, and he's the hero of the story. He's the one guy who's going to restore things or revive things or whatever. And if I'm God, why am I telling this to a kid as opposed to an actual, carpenter or brick mason or general contractor in the congregation? It does put Dunstan in the position as an adult when he wants to be able to start a building program in that church, which is exactly what he did. It gives him the ability to claim, hey, when I was a kid, I had this dream in which God told me to fix this place up. And now we got to do it. If we don't do it, we're disobeying God, so you better pony up. Once again, I'm getting ahead of myself. So by all indications, Dunstan was not a healthy, strapping young man. He was kind of a sickly, thin type. In fact, when he was a teenager, he caught some kind of illness, and they thought he was going to die. But then the strangest thing happened. He went from being bedridden to being completely cured in less than a day. And he was found symptom-free in the second floor church building down the road from his house. And so when they asked him about it, why are you not at home in bed? Why are you here? He had this amazing story to tell. Imagine that. Dunstan has an amazing story to tell. So first off, in this story, you have to understand that an angel had visited him and healed him. Okay, fine. But then teenage Dunstan decided that now that he was healed, he's going to go down to the church and thank God for his healing. Because he's a superstitious Catholic peasant who believes you have to go to the church house to be heard by God. Anyway, it turns out that the devil was surveilling his house and had a pack of dogs outside. And when the dogs saw Dunstan, they chased him through the streets of Glastonbury. He ran to the church, and when he got to the church, there's two versions of the story. One version of the story is that he climbed up a ladder that was leaning up against the side of the church. The other story, the more colorful version, is that the same angel or an angel picked him up off the ground and picked him up and kind of threw him through the window so he'd get away from the dogs. Anyway, he scrambled through the second story window where he was later was found. See, it's just another strange thing that happens in Dunstan's life. So he finishes up school, goes to excuse me. Finishes up school, he takes his monk vows, and he needs a job. So his uncle, as you may recall, was Archbishop of Canterbury and the head of all the churches in England. Got him a job working at the palace, working as the personal priest to King Athelstan. I hope I'm saying that right. Now, Dunstan, in addition to being a proficient storyteller, as we've seen, he was also skilled in sculpture and art and music. Really, pretty much anything the guy put his hands to, he could do, especially when it came to creative endeavors. But there's a couple of odd things. For one thing, he was caught carving idols more than once. When I mean idols, Catholic Church is very fond of idols. We went to the Philippines, and in Cagayan de Oro, there's a big Catholic church there, the biggest Catholic church in Cagayan de Oro. And they have across the street from the big Catholic church, they have a little mall, like a little strip mall that sells idols. Any idol, any size you want, from dashboard size to bigger than a human being size, you can buy in this mall. And as an American, it's really something. But Dunstan wasn't caught carving those kind of idols. He was caught making little figures of Baal and Moloch and Ashtaroth and that sort of stuff. Kind of odd things for a priest / monk to be doing in his spare time. He was also accused of practicing sorcery and memorizing songs used in the worship of ancient false gods. Also weird, they didn't have this word back then, but weird paranormal things kept happening when he was around. Strange voices coming from nowhere, things moving around in the room by themselves, that sort of thing. As a matter of fact, there's a story about how a lady wanted Dunstan to design a tapestry for her. And so he had this harp that he was going to use as a model for a harp that he was going to put in the tapestry. And he hung this thing up on the wall so he could see it better, I guess. And it started to play itself. Now, the lady supposedly witnessed this, but the only testimony we have of this is from Dunstan, who years later was using that story to sort of pad out his resume as a God-ordained miracle worker. So it's worth asking the question. This is the question they should have asked back then. This is the question I would ask if it was going on now. I would say, is this God or is this a poltergeist or something? I mean, strange voices, stuff moving around the room, music playing by itself. There's a place, a hotel in the community where I live called the Spencer House. It's a inn kind of thing. And there used to be, in the bottom floor of that place, there used to be a big fancy piano kind of deal. And when I was a teenager, I was hanging out with a girl who worked there cleaning the rooms at night. So I'm in the Spencer House. I did not come into this wanting to tell a ghost story, but here we are. I'm up in the upstairs. She's in the top floor. She's changing out bed sheets or something, and I'm just talking to her, whatever. And this music starts playing from the downstairs lobby. I said, what is that? She said, yeah, that happens about this time every night. So I go down the stairs. I come down the stairs. Now, they moved that piano since then. I was in the Spencer House a couple of years ago. They've moved that piano from where it used to be. But anyway, so you come down the stairs, and you used to be you hung a right, and you're in this room where this piano is, and that music played all the way down the stairs till I turned the corner, and then the music stopped. And I bid that girl a good evening and went about my merry way. So is this God or is this a poltergeist? I mean, devils and foul spirits really are a thing. Maybe old Dunstan, while he was playing priest, was dabbling in some other stuff. He eventually lost his cushy job with the king because, although the king adored him, people would get a little nervous around Dunstan. Now, his early biographies mention this sort of stuff, and they mention it as part of the miracle-working aura that followed him everywhere he went. But the modern biographies, they kind of gloss over his dismissal, if they even mention it at all. So he had a job at the palace, lost his job, he's out of work. He moves back to his hometown of Glastonbury, and he built himself a little cell, a little room on the side up against the wall of a monastery. Now, this story doesn't make any sense to me. He gives the measurements of this room, and it winds up being about 5 foot by 2 foot by 4 foot, which is, the size of a coffin or whatever. Anyway, the story is he became sort of a blacksmith, and he ran a little forge inside this little room that was sort of attached to the larger building. And it was there in his cell/workplace that another strange thing happens. He claimed that the devil, who apparently was done surveilling his house and sending dogs after him, the devil himself would come to this cell to bother him, sometimes in the shape of a bear or a dog or a serpent or a fox. And Dunstan says the devil would stand outside, lean into the window, and tempt him in wanton conversation, whatever that means. Your guess is as good as mine. But let's stop for a second here. The Bible says, speaking of Satan, and the context, by the way, is unforgiveness among the brethren, that we are, quote, not ignorant of his devices. Okay, so where in Scripture do you see the devil hanging around outside a Christian's workplace/house, disguised as a wild animal chewing the fat? I mean, how many times does a talking fox got to show up at your door before you start saying, I've made some bad choices in life? As Spencer Smith says, did you put the LSD in my coffee again? Okay, so where do you see the devil speaking to anyone disguised as an animal? You say Genesis 3. Okay, where else? I mean, do you have any New Testament examples? You see, that's the problem when you don't have a Bible. You don't have much to go for. You just make up stuff. Anyway, so one night Dunstan got tired of the devil coming by and bending his ear about the local gossip or whatever, and he claimed that one night he seized the devil by the nose with the hot tongs from the forge Now, how do we know this? How do we know this story? Because the next day, when his neighbors wanted to know what all the yelling was about in the middle of the night, this is the story he told him. He told him the devil came by, and I was tired of him, and I grabbed him by the nose. And the story stuck so well that the symbol for Saint Dunstan is a pair of blacksmith's tongs. A pair of blacksmith's tongs and a dove. But we'll get to that in a minute. Weirder and weirder. See, it sounds really silly when you say it out loud, that the devil came to your house disguised as a fox or a bear and was talking to you, and you were cool with that, and then one day you got tired of it, and you grabbed him by the nose with a pair of hot tongs. It sounds silly when you say it out loud. But if you are an ignorant Catholic peasant with no Bible living in a town known for stuff like that, maybe it doesn't seem so silly. You know, you ought to be so thankful that you have a Bible, that you can take things that happen and sort them out. Anyway, Dunstan achieved some local fame for, the devil nose pinching thing, along with his uncle's pull, because his uncle was still Archbishop of Canterbury. He was able to get a job as the head of the monastery there in Glastonbury. It was a very prominent monastery, and he managed to get a job as the head of it. And it's not a job at the palace, mind you, like he had before, but it has certain perks. For example, a widow of the royal family, she got really sick. She was dying. She wanted to ask Dunstan's counsel on what she should do to secure her soul, because, you don't have a gospel or anything, right? You just have, let's go down and talk to this guy in the funny clothes and see what he says. Anyway, so she asked the counsel about what she should do, and he told her that she needed to give away, divest herself of worldly goods. She needed to get rid of every penny. Well, she did. She gave it all to the monastery, and as the head of the monastery, Dunstan had first dibs, as they say. Now, this opened up a whole new world for Dunstan. And one of the things that he started to really endorse and enforce was, quote unquote, reform of the Anglo-Saxon Church of the. This is not the Church of England. This is still the pre-Church of England days. So a key component of this reform that he thought was necessary was he was going to promote celibacy among the priests. So you could enter the priesthood if you were married, but you could not go home to your wife. And if you were a young priest, you could not get married. And, that's how that goes. But one of the things that celibacy among the priests does, in case you've never thought about that, there's no reason for it. There's no scriptural command for it. It literally just comes up in about the 9th or 10th century. The reason this happens, the reason this benefits the organization is when a priest, who's collecting all this money from the people and is running this religious con game, when they die rich, they pass their property on to the local church, which means they pass it on to Dunstan. See what I mean, Jelly Bean? So Dunstan became rich in money and concubines. Oh, that's another thing. They could have concubines. They couldn't have wives, because a concubine doesn't get an inheritance, right? So you can have your little dalliances on the side, but when it comes time to cash out, you better know where to make that check out to. So the church at the monastery at Glastonbury was the richest and most honored church in the kingdom. Here's a quote, by the way. The guy named Dr. Southey wrote a book called The Book of the Church. And this is a quote. He was an arch miracle monger and a reproach to Christianity. Dunstan would have, in any age or station, been a remarkable man, but no times would have suited him as well as the dark ages of priestcraft in which he flourished. So with this much money and this much power and this much influence, and when you have the power of the souls of people, that's a lot of power to have. By the way, no pastor has the power of your soul. Just putting that out there. So with all this money and all this stuff going on, he managed to worm his way back into the palace life. So when the king, or one of the various kings, would throw a big banquet or party or some kind, Dunstan was always invited. He was one of the guys. In fact, it was at one of these banquets where Dunstan pushed his luck a little too far. I believe the guy thought he was untouchable. I believe the guy thought he was bulletproof. So the king at the time, let me quote this from you. This is the official sanitized version of the story I'm about to tell, okay? So here's a quote from BritainExpress.com. Dunstan acted as a royal advisor and negotiator for Edmund, his successor Edred, and helped establish a period of peace from Danish attack. In 955, Dunstan's zeal got him into trouble when he reproved young King Edward for moral laxity. Edward promptly confiscated Dunstan's property and exiled the monk. Okay, so here's the part they didn't tell you. So the king at the time, Edward, had a young wife, and it was the result of an arranged marriage from back when he was a teenager. And she apparently was very beautiful. In fact, every account you read of this story, it mentions how pretty she is. So there's that. King adored her, and I don't know if it's because of her age or because some other factor, depending on who you ask. But the church had never officially endorsed or sanctioned his marriage to her. So that meant, since the Pope picks the winners and losers in this game, she could live at the palace, but she would be considered a concubine and not a queen. Okay? So here's the scene. All these guys are at this big drunken banquet, and Edward the king slips out to go visit his wife/concubine. Dunstan's there, and after a while somebody notices that the king's not there, and they start talking about how, talk amongst the men about how it's really inappropriate for the king to slip out during a banquet, and somebody needs to go get him, somebody should go get him, and somehow Dunstan gets picked to go do this. I don't know if he volunteers, I don't know. So he goes to the wife's chambers, and he finds the king there, and he proceeds to not only chide the king, but he apparently was hurling insult at the king's bride. I mean, she's only a concubine, right? She doesn't deserve any respect. So Dunstan then grabs the king and physically drags him back to the banquet hall, throws him in the middle of the floor, and says, there, I went and got him. Well, that is, as they say, a bridge too far. So once everybody sobers up, the king stripped Dunstan of all his royal honors and had his property confiscated and banished him to Belgium, of all places. Now, part of the process of confiscating all the man's property is to have royal auditors go and document all of Dunstan's wealth, all his stuff. So the auditors are counting and they're making lists, And as they're doing this, laughter can be heard coming from nowhere. And Dunstan's there. He's there to witness them putting his stuff in crates or boxes, whatever they did to haul it out. And so the auditors got spooked, and Dunstan told them that's the devil laughing at the victory the king had handed to the forces of darkness by hindering the great man of God. I'm going to assume these people had never heard of a ventriloquist. And if I was having a theory here, I would say Dunstan had learned at some point in his teenage years to throw his voice. And he did it with such skill that it made it sound like it was coming from someplace else. I mean, you got to go for the obvious solution first. But anyway, so at this point, Dunstan is penniless, and he's banished to Belgium, of all places. But his henchmen are still there in town. They're still the religious structure he had put in place. You take a mob boss, you put him behind bars, and all his lieutenants are still out. It's like that. So, at the first opportunity, these guys struck back at this king who had humiliated Dunstan. They pronounced the king divorced. They had his young wife arrested, and they branded her in the face and banished her. So she escaped later on and rejoined her husband in England, but she was kidnapped, basically, and maybe sort of they killed her. Either way, she died, and the details are really murky. What I think Dunstan orchestrated the whole thing from afar. This king wound up losing his throne, and yes, British history is very complicated. Now, so this young king out of the picture, Dunstan returns to power and prestige. Edgar was now the king of Northumbria, which is one of the little kingdoms there, and he made Dunstan the Bishop of London, and then later on he was made the Archbishop of Canterbury by Pope John the 12th. So he went from being banished to being in charge of everything. Now, as a way of cementing himself even further to his royal sugar daddy, Dunstan oversaw almost every aspect of Edgar's coronation. He designed the coronation crown, and let's see here. Here is another quote. Quote, he altered the ceremony to put emphasis on the bond between church and monarch, making the coronation a sacred act, emulating the ceremony of consecration for priests. Dunstan's coronation ceremony still forms the basis of royal coronations today. So when King George that is his name, right? Elizabeth's son, the guy's on the throne now. Anyway, that guy. Yes, history began in 1776. Everything before that was a mistake. Anyway, so when that guy, when the current King of England went through his little ceremony, that part of that ceremony involves a priest, the Archbishop of Canterbury, coming in. And they got a little globe, and they got a scepter, and they got all this paraphernalia that involved that ceremony that you watched on TV a year or so ago, whatever. That's based on Dunstan. Dunstan wanted to make sure everybody that saw this ceremony understood that as the priesthood, he was vitally connected to the throne. Oh, but the circus rolls on. So now he's Archbishop of Canterbury, and he's performing his first mass as the Archbishop of Canterbury. And while he's doing this, a dove landed on him. See, I told you we'd come back to the dove. And that dove stayed there during the entire ceremony. Now, Dunstan claimed that it was the same dove that John the Baptist had seen during the baptism of Jesus. I don't know how you say that with a straight face. Now, Dunstan also claimed that he had a dream where his departed mother was being married to Jesus, and the dream was something about his mother being the church and the church being married to Jesus, or something. I read what he said, and I still don't understand what his point was. He also said that an angel had written a hymn especially for Dunstan, and he performed it in church, because remember, he was a very talented musician. Once again, I have to ask the question, though, dear friends, is this how God does things? Or is it at least possible that this con man trained a dove to land on him and stay there? Which is the more likely explanation? Just like when Jesus Christ gets up from the grave, what's the more likely explanation? A guy that you'd beaten half to death, rolled a stone away by himself, disarmed a bunch of soldiers, and then managed to escape and be in good enough condition to where he was able to walk around and talking to people a couple of days later, 3 days later. Or he got up from the dead like he said he would. So King Edgar died, the guy that he helped coronate. And with his royal protector out of the way, some of the party began to plot, and they began to scheme on how to curb Dunstan's power and his influence. And a council was held, and as they plotted against Dunstan, supposedly a voice cried out from a crucifix hanging on the wall, "Let it not be, let it not be." So the ventriloquist had struck again. Maybe he just had somebody on the other side of the wall yelling. I don't know. But Dunstan stayed installed in a position of influence. Now, he lingered on for a bit, and he acted as advisor to this king and to that king. But after a while, actually, another one of his royal sugar daddies was murdered in 978. Dunstan retired from the political life. He sort of hung around Canterbury and with lots of influence and no real responsibilities. Now, a lot of the stories that we've told so far about Dunstan, you can chalk up to him lying. You can chalk up to parlor tricks. You can chalk up to even occult powers. This one, I don't know, man. So Dunstan died in 988, and about a week before he died, one of his assistants claimed that he had seen a vision. And in this vision, the cherubim and seraphim of heaven attended to Dunstan, and they promised to come collect his soul the following Saturday. So Dunstan gets sick about Wednesday, and by Sunday or Saturday, he's in bed, dying. And so the following Saturday, as he lays in his bed ill, the attendants claimed his body floated up from the bed over and over again. He finally died and quit floating around the room. Now, this is not a story that Dunstan told, but this is a story that's told by almost all of his little fanboy biographers. But it's omitted from the modern versions of his life. When you go to Britain Express, they don't mention this story. They don't mention him floating around the room. It would be nice to have a first-hand account of it from somebody who was there, but I honestly can't find any. So at his funeral, because, the Catholic Church is a dressed-up pagan death cult, you say, why are you always picking on these guys? They deserve to be picked on. They murdered my family for 600 years in the name of religion. They teach damnable heresies and a false gospel that sends people to hell. So I don't have any. I have a great compassion for Catholic people. I have no use for Catholic doctrine. But anyway, so multitudes that were at his funeral, because he was a very popular fellow, they beat themselves in the face and they lacerated their flesh while they mourned for him. Now, I do have a biblical precedent for that. Remember the prophets of Baal in First King? I mean, you don't see anywhere in the New Testament. You don't see, even when Christ died, you don't see the disciples, the apostles, cutting themselves and flagellating themselves and going through this rigmarole. You don't, do you? But I've been around some Catholic. I've been to Catholic funerals. I've been around some Catholic funerals where they climb on the casket and they try to climb in the grave and they wail, they beat their breast and they all this kind of stuff. It's more works. But anyway, so they took his body, done floating around the room, and they deposited it in the cathedral there where he had presided, and it became a shrine. And because it was a shrine, it was a source of income. People made pilgrimages from all over the place, all over the world, to stand over the guy's grave, and he is considered the patron saint of, quote, armorers and gunsmiths. Yeah. This is the case because he was canonized in 1079 after all the fanboy biographies came out. Now, to be canonized, in case you don't know, that does not mean they shoot you from a cannon. That obviously would be much more entertaining. No, it means, dear friend, that multiple miracles are attributed to this guy after he dies, and he was, quote unquote, made a saint. I was made a saint in 1995 when I trusted Jesus Christ for the propitiation of my sins. But, not everybody gets that deal. I mean, everybody could have that deal, but not everybody gets that deal. So here we are. Dunstan the Mad Monk. So what do you make of all this? Well, that's the real question. Is he a miracle worker? Is he a con man? Is he a ventriloquist? Is he a sorcerer? Is he a whitewashed, quote-unquote, saint of the Roman Catholic Church? It's not like they're ashamed of him. He has a feast day dedicated to him. It's in May, I think. They're not ashamed of him, which is another odd thing. So there you go. That's that little piece of church history, Dunstan the Mad Monk. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope you got something out of it. Man, thank God I got a Bible, right? Well, this is Mike Alford signing off. Thank you for listening, all four of you, and I will see you on the other side.